If I can ask everybody to please take their seats. And please open your pop cans now. Turn off your cell phones, yeah, please. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Paulette. I am the director of the Ford Leadership Forum at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, Making the World Safe for Democracy. And I am thrilled to partner with the Baylor and Washington program. I think this is the third or fourth time we've partnered together, and it's been a remarkably successful and fertile partnership between the two groups. I just want to thank you all for attending and welcome everybody who's attending online. We've helped sponsor the online feed tonight. And with that, I will turn over the podium to David Corey from Baylor University, who will be moderating the panel discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff Paulette, and we are also grateful to the Gerald R. Ford Leadership Forum, which he programming for which he directs. I'm also glad you all came out on a chilly night, and there's been snow, and there's a million reasons not to come, but I'm so glad to see you all. I want to thank two other sponsors. You can see them on the back of the program somewhere, maybe inside the program. One is an interesting organization, and I want to thank my friend Ryan Wolf at TFAS. That's the Fund for American Studies. They're co-sponsoring tonight. They want to encourage you all to look them up and perhaps take a part in their programming, especially what they call the Public Policy Fellowship, which is a fellowship that explores post-war conservatism and how thinkers like Hayek and Russell Kirk and Frank Meyer attempted to resolve inner tensions within conservatism between freedom and order. Applications are this spring if anybody has an interest in conservatism. Also, I'd like to thank my friend Joseph Prudhomme. He is the director of the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture at Washington College. And that's an institute very similar to Baylor and Washington, dedicated to studying religion's influence on America and the world, and exploring pressing issues facing contemporary society, and even re-articulating the value of American founding principles. If any of you are new to Baylor and Washington, I especially want to extend a warm welcome to you. We are Baylor's located in Waco, Texas. I don't know if you've heard of us. We do have a football team and other sporting things. I'm not a sports person myself. And we send about 20 students up here for the fall semester and the spring semester. They do full-time internships and take classes. But we also put on public events like this one, where we try to take up issues that we don't think are being discussed civilly or deeply, or maybe there's a religious angle that we think is being quite neglected. We try to take these issues up and go philosophically deep in a public setting and also display civil discourse in our age in which it seems to be rarer and rarer. So with that, let me introduce the topic. It's presidential rhetoric, its power and limits. Rhetoric is a door to open. We may go beyond it. I don't think we can talk about rhetoric for long without getting at some pretty more fundamental issues about our institutions and about our culture. But let me just try to start the conversation right before I introduce our panelists with two observations that I would like to make, two very brief observations related to the presidents. I should say we're not going to talk about the current campaign. I'm not even allowed to talk about that as representing Baylor University. But we're taking a much longer and deeper view. We're not talking about the current campaign or current candidates. We're talking about presidential rhetoric and the office of the presidency, or the institution of the presidency in general. Observation one, I would like to say, it seems to me we expect too much. We seem increasingly to expect too much from our presidents, that they will solve every conceivable problem for us, even problems we can't solve in other more deliberative institutions such as Congress or local state houses. And I think we should ask ourselves, how can we really expect presidents to solve problems that are deeply contested among citizens without violating the freedom and political equality of some citizens? How can we really expect presidents to stand above the fray and serve as saviors for us? I chose the word deliberately. Observation 2. I think we get too little from our contemporary presidents in terms of rhetoric. We seem to be experiencing a gradual shift in presidential rhetoric over the years, a decreasing concern to speak in a unifying way. Instead, presidential candidates and office holders seem to speak primarily to their base and primarily to the most extreme parts of their base. Thus, presidential rhetoric today lacks certain qualities that I believe it possessed at some points in the past. It is not healing. It is not politically holistic. It is not expressive of our common values. It is rather divisive, warlike, and partial. Those two observations, one about how we expect too much from our presidents, and the other about how we are badly let down by presidential rhetoric and seem satisfied by that. These two observations give rise, I think, to a number of questions that we can explore, and I hope they're fruitful for starting the conversation. I want to announce you've got the bios in your handouts there, so I don't want to read them in full. I just want to say that Yuval Levin has done things for Baylor and Washington before. We're very grateful to have him. He's Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He is also notably the Editor-in-Chief of National Affairs, a journal that I think is terrific and I am glad to recommend. Dana Nelson is Professor of English at Vanderbilt and author of many books, but most notably for present purposes, her 2010 book, Bad for Democracy: How the Presidency Undermines the Power of the People. And Alan Gelzo is a distinguished research scholar. He spent most of his career, to my memory, at Gettysburg College. And he is now the director of the James Madison Program's Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship at Princeton University. So let me take a seat. And I'm going to moderate a discussion and watch the time so that because I'm sure you'll have questions for the panelists. I'm going to keep my phone on because I'm not good at watching time because I'm a professor. And my team, Molly Moore and Beth Butler, to whom I extend my profound gratitude for their hard work in putting this together, they might let me know it's time to start wrapping things up. So I'm just going to keep this near me. And I should be mic'd. And I'd like to start on a sort of idealistic note. We're not going to stay there for too long. But let me ask Professor Gelzo, first of all. What can we ideally expect from presidential rhetoric? There's a tendency to point out, I think it's a too easy tendency to point out that no rhetoric is good and to point to the election of 1800 and use it as an example of all politics is obviously nasty. But actually, I think that's a bit too cynical. And I wonder if Professor Gelzo might point to certain presidents or periods of history where we actually see presidential rhetoric doing some positive good for the country.
Well, it won't surprise you, David, that the first direction I'm going to point is to Lincoln.
I'm not surprised.
Lincoln is remarkable in a number of ways. First of all, he is a great rhetorician. Well, he was a lawyer, professionally, so he knew how to make a case persuasively in front of a jury, whether that jury was 12 capable Illinoisans in a county courthouse somewhere in central Illinois, or the entire nation. He always is in persuasion mode. And what helps him that way is that although he never enjoyed more than a year's worth of formal schooling, he was a voracious reader with a tremendous capacity for memory. He read very widely, both in classical and 19th century literature. Nothing was more beloved for Lincoln than Shakespeare. And you can certainly hear those rolling Shakespearean periods in Lincoln's public rhetoric. There is a beauty in what he has to say. There is a music that is, all right, it's not iambic pentameter. Nevertheless, still, there is that in Lincoln. And Lincoln is the kind of president whose public rhetoric we remember in whole speeches. We remember the entirety of the Gettysburg Address. We remember the entirety of the second inaugural. We don't really do that with other presidents. For Lincoln, rhetoric was a way of bringing people to a point and understanding why certain things were going to be happening or why they should. Sometimes it's a matter of rallying opinion. Sometimes it's a matter of pacifying. At the end of the first inaugural, he talks about we are not enemies, we are friends. We must be guided by the better angels of our nature. There's the Shakespearean echo. Sometimes he's willing to shimmy out on a limb and confront people. In the second inaugural, he tells people that it's not time for a victory lap, that the war has been a judgment come from God on both North and South alike, that both North and South alike have imbrued their hands in the evil of slavery. Now, that is almost an example of what you might call this negative presidential rhetoric. But then he turns, there's this hinge, and the hinge is his appeal to the judgment of God. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And that allows him to move in that marvelous final paragraph where he talks about, with malice toward none, with charity for all, we're going to bind up the wounds of the nation. He was conscious that there were many people who were unhappy with him for saying that. Many people who wanted this to be the moment when he puts both hands up and says, touchdown, we win, you lose. And the second inaugural faces in exactly the opposite direction. And after he delivered the inaugural, he had a letter from Thurlow Weed, a great political manager. And he replied to Weed's letter and he says, a lot of people are not going to be happy with that inaugural. But I think there were things in it that had to be said, and I had to be the one to say them.
Are there other presidents that you would point to? I know you can go on about Lincoln. I wondered too, because I want to make a turn here
Right.
to applying.
Well, I say as much as I do about Lincoln, because Lincoln is the big exception. When we look at the broad spectrum of presidential rhetoric, it gets a lot more disappointing. I mean, for one thing, we tend not to think about speeches as a whole. We tend to think maybe at best certain chunks, but mostly it comes down to sound bites. When we think about Washington, we think about the farewell address. We think about the great letter to the Truro synagogue, giving to bigotry no sanction. Great phrases like that, but not more than phrases. You know, Wilson, we're going to make the world safe for democracy. John F. Kennedy, don't ask what your country can do for you, and so on like that. Even Ronald Reagan at the Berlin Wall, Mr. Brezhnev, tear down this wall. What we remember phrases. Yeah. But we don't get that soaring architecture. And I suspect that's largely because that's not what presidential rhetoric is intended to do. That in that respect, Lincoln is an exception rather than a guide. If you look at that broad, at home I have lined up 12 volumes, Messages and Papers of the President. This is a late 19th century edition.
That's exactly how I picture your home.
All right, yeah, well, it's all of the inaugural addresses, proclamations, public letters and whatnot of the presidents. And it is volume after volume of the most sensationally boring stuff. There's no vivid strikes of lightning anywhere in it. And I think that tells us where, in fact, the center of presidential rhetoric really lies. That it doesn't lie in challenge. It doesn't lie even in persuasion. There are moments of great negativity. Andrew Jackson, great moment of negativity, especially in the veto message for the National Bank. But beyond that, Franklin Pierce, does anyone remember what Franklin Pierce said? How about Millard Fillmore? Anyone here belong to the Millard Fillmore Society? Ha, ha, ha. No, because there is nothing particularly memorable about anything they say, and I don't think that's an accident.
So you've already foreshadowed a theme I want to get to in a minute. I'm going to delay to get there, and that is that expecting a lot from presidential rhetoric already assumes something about the purpose of the presidency.
Yeah.
And we'll get there.
Yeah.
But let me point out that in your remarks about Lincoln, even when Lincoln was doing what he was doing so well, I doubt it could be the same today. And so I want to look over at Yuval for a second. And Yuval is very good on pluralism, and we've talked about pluralism and liberalism together before. It seems to me that the Shakespearean, the biblical, the classical tropes, but maybe especially the biblical ones, that Lincoln can think we all have in common actually reveal how far we've come into pluralism and polarization. Polarization is us fighting each other, but of course pluralism is us having wildly different worldviews, not just two different worldviews, but tons of different religious outlooks, worldviews. And it seems like we're so fractured and pluralistic now that one wonders if any president could possibly speak in a way that unifies us. Yuval?
Well, you know, Lincoln did know something about division, and certainly spoke to a country that was divided in a way that in some ways is more intense and more profound than we are. To me, what stands out about Lincoln's rhetoric is that it is rhetoric in the classical sense. Aristotle says political rhetoric stands out from others because it is speech about action. It is an answer to the question, what shall we do together? And Lincoln's speeches are an answer to the question, what shall we do together and why? They give reasons for acting in common. And in that sense, they are really rhetoric. They are political rhetoric in the deepest sense. I think most of our presidents have not really thought that way about what their speeches are. I worked for a president, for George W. Bush, for 4 years. And, you know, there were high moments of speech making for Bush here and there. There are phrases we might remember. But I would say that he tended to think about his rhetoric as a kind of box to check. You know, there's going to be a State of the Union address by President Biden beginning of March. And the way those work now are boxes to check, right? It's a 7-hour speech, or it seems to be, it feels like it. And it's just a series of things that sort of have to be said. It would be very hard to describe those speeches as answering the question, what shall we do together? And I think part of the reason that Lincoln stepped up in the way he did is that the moment did demand it. And it demanded it because it was a moment of division. But I also think that there is a way there of thinking about the nature of the political that doesn't come as naturally to a lot of our chief executives. The way that I think about pluralism, in a sense, you know, in a free society, there are always profound differences of opinion. That's unavoidable. You know, the framers and the founders understood that as well as we do. But there's an idea of unity at the core of our way of thinking about government in America that implicitly says unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And the question, how can we act together when we don't think alike, is the great political question in a free society. It's the question to which our institutions are an answer, including very much the institution of the presidency. And to the extent that presidential rhetoric fits the framework of the institution of the presidency, I think it can be very high rhetoric. But most of our presidents now don't really think in those terms. And increasingly, really, they understand themselves in their rhetoric to be actors in the culture, to be culturally prominent figures. And that calls for a different kind of rhetoric than traditional political rhetoric, and it shows.
I think it's easy to be cynical and with good grounding on the fact that presidential candidates, they have a dog in the race, obviously, and then when they speak, they're speaking for a certain partial point of view.
Well, let me say, they're speaking for a point of view, yes, but the question is, are they asking to be everyone's president, or are they speaking for a portion of our political culture? And I think a lot of contemporary presidents, without thinking it through in this way, see themselves as speaking for a portion of our society rather than speaking to all of it.
Yeah, it's more warlike, and they're not actually trying to find a unifying common ground. I've always found you to be hopeful, and I want to ask you if you think even among our deep differences, there still is in America a unifying common ground on which we can base our political life together.
Yeah, look, I think Lincoln had it right. That unifying common ground involves the core principles articulated at the opening of the Declaration of Independence. Those principles are very widely shared. Even when we disagree intensely, we disagree about who actually stands for those principles and who is betraying them. And they do offer us, I think, a lot of unity. I am hopeful. I would say I would distinguish hopefulness from optimism. I'm not optimistic. I live in Washington, and you can't be. But optimism is just the sense that things are going to be fine, and that's not true. Hopefulness is the sense that things could work because the resources are there for us to draw on if we are able to rise to the moment. And I absolutely think that our political tradition gives us the resources to deal with the problems we have. Whether we will do that is up to us.
I might come back and ask you what some of our commonalities are that we can build on.
Yeah.
Turn to Dana for a second. The presidency is not a static institution. It changes over time. And its relationship to the other institutions and to the culture at large changes over time. I think that Dana has her finger on the pulse of this in a way that is really right and refreshing. And I wanted her to be in part of this conversation because she's critical of the kind of expectations we put on our presidents and the kind of godlike characteristics our presidents sometimes exhibit. And so Dana, part of Dana's awareness is that a certain way of thinking about the presidency actually undermines and jeopardizes political participation and democratic power. And I think that's quite serious, actually. I think we can punt to the president to do the political work for us. So Dana, anything to say about how that evolution is now and your worries about the way we look at the institution of the presidency?
Let me try to do a really quick historical synopsis, trying to figure out how much I want to say. My argument is basically that the framers who put the president in place to symbolize national unity and to be a check on the democratic enthusiasm of what they called the first branch, the congressional branch, right? That's the democratic branch. They wanted to check on that, the possibility of democratic access. I don't think they ever imagined what the presidency has become. And their fundamental mistake is that they created three branches, one populated by now nearly 500 people, which cannot act to guard its own interests, never acts to guard its own interests. A branch with 9 people divided amongst themselves, and a branch led by a single person who's very effective. Every president has been at guarding and gaining more power for the executive. So what they didn't imagine was the structural overbalancing of their very carefully calibrated mechanism for checks and balance in government. The American people, the presidency wasn't intuitive for them at first. In the first presidential election, more people in Pennsylvania turned out to run for to vote for the unopposed governor than they did to vote in the presidential race. So Americans have learned over time to load expectations in the presidency, and that's something I describe in the book as presidentialism, which has been growing over time. And I argue that presidentialism is basically the psychic prison house for people's sovereignty. And that is just to remind that the sovereignty of the people was a radical idea in Greece all those many years ago. It is radical now. It's hard to do. It's a habitat we constantly have to build and nourish and commit to and work at and be disgusted by and keep coming back to the table and compromising and losing. It takes a habitat and a mindset, but the president promises to do it for us. And you can hear it in all the presidential rhetoric now. He's checking out RFK's Jr. site, and he too is promising to move mountains and make things happen. And they're always promising stuff they literally can't do. Although, thanks to the whole adventure of venture constitutionalism that we've been seeing since the Reagan presidency, where they push and push and push, and mostly get away with grabbing more and more power, inventing ever more presidential decrees, memoranda, orders. You know, at any point that Congress gets mad about one name, they just start calling them something else. And so the presidency has gotten more powerful. It's gotten more warlike. And David was referring to that. I think presidents increasingly see themselves as representing the true America. That is their party. And the presidency itself is set up as a zero-sum game. One guy wins, one guy loses. So increasingly, we have a really dependent relationship to the president. I think we have a ton of political energy. I think that explains how people can put so much energy into following primaries, following these contests for 3 years before they actually start to happen. But because we keep imagining that when we elect the right president, he's not only going to save us, he's going to save the world. Right after President Obama was elected, there was that wonderful jib-jab cartoon. He's Barack Obama, he's come to save the world. He's out there venturing around, slashing pirates. Yeah. So the fantasies we load up into the president infantilize us. They make us think that democracy is about unity. It's about everybody getting along. It's about everybody falling into line. It de-skills us for the ongoing hard work of democracy. It infantilizes us. It makes us have childish expectations, not just for the presidency, but for what democracy means.
Let me press right there. Let me ask about that, because just as the presidency is not a static institution, and it's changing and indeed growing in power, American culture is not a static culture.
Right.
So I would like to hear your take, too, on, I hate to ask it so directly, but to what extent do you think we're still capable of democracy? And I don't mean just in our skills. I also mean in the differences, the new differences I mean, Yuval is right, and Madison said it too, a free people will be factious.
Yes.
You can't stop that,
Of
right?
course.
But I do think there's a difference between our factions today and the factions that Madison was looking at. Not only are there more of them, but in part because of the way we've looked to our national government, we've put so much, there's so much scope of the national government that we realize that to lose the presidency is absolutely unacceptable. And so we fight an awful lot harder. We take this an awful lot more seriously. So I guess what I want to ask you is, given the kind of pluralism and polarization that is typical and oft remarked about American society today, are we still capable of doing the hard work of democracy?
I totally believe we're capable of doing it. I think the question is whether we will find structures that support that capacity. So what I can say is I'm teaching classes at Vanderbilt. I'm teaching one right now called Why Argue About Politics? And in that class, I teach my students how to disagree respectfully. And they're hungry for it, and they are happy learning how to do it. And they get so excited when they start to learn how to do it. Because when you open your mind to arguments from people you disagree with, you learn. And they get really excited by that. And it's not hard to get that cycle going. I think that we have a lot of capacity for it. We don't have institutions that support it. And that's the problem. And then we've got the horrible accelerant of social media and the way the algorithms of social media have overtaken digital life in general, which push for anger and fear and distrust and all of the things that make that work even harder to do.
I'll work my way this way again. Yuval has been writing for 5 to 8 years, don't make me quote that, on institutions. And so how do we renew these institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with that diagnosis. But I don't think that the problem is new. I think the problem is precisely the problem that so worried James Madison. James Madison is an unusual figure in the American political tradition. He is almost the only person whose primary worry is about cohesion, about holding things together. You can find in the founding generation people like Thomas Jefferson who think about equality and social justice. You can find people like Hamilton who think about dynamism and social order. There's one person, I think in our entire political tradition, who thinks about unity and social cohesion as the core problem for democracy. And Madison takes for granted that this is a serious, potentially deadly problem for a republic. And his solution to it is to formulate a set of institutions that can allow us to act together when we don't think alike. That's what the constitutional system tries to do. At the center of that, the absolute core of that, is coalition building, negotiating, bargaining, and therefore Congress. The core work of allowing our society to work despite its differences is work that has to be done in the legislature. And I think that when the legislature doesn't work, there's no amount of presidential action that can make up for it. There's no amount of court action that can make up for it. The three branches, they don't just divide power among them and they each have some amount of power. They do different things. And if Congress isn't working, I don't think there's anything that presidential rhetoric or presidential action could do to make up for that deficit. And we are in a moment now when Congress is not working well, is not doing its core job, which is to bargain and negotiate over important national problems to arrive at tolerable ways forward.
I might ask you more about institutions in a minute, but that we ended up there not by accident.
Yeah.
There is a moment in history when we decided to move congressional power into institutions of bureaucratic competency and excellence. And there is a particular figure behind that change, and that's Wilson. So there's an elephant in the room, because we all see the problem, but when Wilson advocated those changes, Wilson himself was solving problems. He thought the system as it was designed couldn't work in the modern age. And Professor Gelzo, I wonder if you'd like to say anything about that. I'm not a historian.
Oh, the speech he gave describing the Constitution and the 18th century, he compared it to a Newtonian clock. And we have to understand, Wilson argued, that that's not the way things really operate. The real world is not a clock. The real world is an organism.
He learned this in Germany.
And he learns this, but the thing is, he learns it not only in Germany. I mean, you can say, yes, all right, there's the hidden hand of Hegel, all right?
Yep.
But it's also a matter that he's picking up what is a much more important strain of thinking in the culture. There's an overall romantic context, and there is the Darwinian context. And all of that is what Wilson is appealing to. He's basically saying something has changed in the way we understand the world. It's not the Newtonian clock. It's not something you can balance, that you can say, well, here's factionalism, and here are the mechanisms we're going to create to resist factionalism. Mechanisms don't work. Organisms do. How do you make organisms work? You regulate them. And at the base of that lies what you're describing, and that is the birth of a regulatory state. So for Wilson, that's not only a description about a change in the view of the presidency, that's a description of an overall change in the nature of society itself. Wilson is a leading edge of that, and he is assisted in that respect.
It's a change in our political philosophy,
Yeah.
and one can ask whether that's compatible with the founding.
Well,
Can't you?
I think that is an important question to ask. Now, curiously, is how little it got asked in his day, how little real challenge there was. You could see it from some individuals. Henry Cabot Lodge is a particularly good example that way. But by and large, people looked at especially the crisis of World War I, and they rallied around the kind of state that was being created. Because World War I, it was said well, I think, that in 1918 by one of Wilson's critics, war is the health of the state. And what Wilson aspired to do, he was assisted in doing by the emergence of World War I. That becomes the excuse for doing it. There's Wilson, and then you move one generation beyond Wilson to Franklin Roosevelt. And when Franklin Roosevelt inaugurates what comes to be known as the New Deal, in his inaugural address in 1933, what does he refer to? He refers to a Wilsonian warlike emergency, which is going to justify still more of the regulatory state, because the unregulated organism, as far as he is, from his perspective, is not working. It has failed Americans. It has produced a Great Depression. Therefore, the response to it has to be regulation of the organism.
Going back to Wilson, there's so much going on here, because you're actually identifying the beginning of when presidents start to evoke war, and if not a real war, then a war on poverty, or a war, and this is
Right.
tremendously helpful for what Wilson particularly thought an organism needed to thrive. which is a vision.
I think there's a
It's
contrast.
a kind of single vision that a nation needs to get behind.
There's an interesting contrast here with Lincoln, because Lincoln, of course, has not only a war, he has a civil war. Yeah. And he calls into being various aspects of the state that had not existed before. What's curious is that as soon as the war is over, everything demobilizes, and not only government hiring statistics, but even the federal budget goes shrinking back to what it had been more or less before the war. Never gets to the pre-war level, but that's because you're paying post-war pensions to Union veterans. And they become the pig and the python, so to speak, of the federal budget. But with Lincoln, the war is a moment. Now, he will invoke from time to time necessity as a justification for certain actions that he takes. But the war creates no regulatory state. And what you find as you move into the post-war years is, in fact, a reversion back to the 1850s and the size of the federal government. Now, the big question is, was that really justified by the need we had in the post-war years for Reconstruction? Did Reconstruction call for something more dramatic? That remains one of the open questions in American history that takes, I think, a good deal more in the way of exploration than we have given to it.
So it seems like we're here. We've got a moment in history when the way that the founding was supposed to empower people to practice politics from their state and local political culture upward to the national culture was dismantled, and not ignorantly dismantled, but masterfully dismantled by a president who rather admired, if not kingship, then at least the parliamentary system of Britain.
What is interesting that way is if you want to identify people who admire the parliamentary system of Britain, go and look at the heads of the Confederate States of America. I mean, as much as the leadership of the Confederacy talked endlessly about state rights, the moment the Confederacy came into existence, the rights of the Confederate States promptly disappeared. And a very centralized form of government emerged in the hands of the Confederate leadership in Richmond during the Civil War, to the point where citizens in the southern states had to submit to an internal passport system. This is a passport, this is the 19th century. We're not talking QR codes here, all right? A passport system, that's the kind of thing you associate with monarchy. Even the Confederate Constitution contains provisions that you more often expect to see in parliamentary style government. So the Confederacy points in a direction that really takes some significant steps away from the founding. Lincoln sees what he is doing is an attempt to run this war and try to do it as much as a civil war will permit within the boundaries of what the founders have laid out. He believes at the end of his life that he has succeeded, and the question that Woodrow Wilson opens up is, well, no, I don't think he did, because Wilson's notion actually has much more in common with the notion of the leadership of the Confederacy.
Dana and Yuval.
You know, I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
I think the reference to a parliamentary system opens up an important question here, because ultimately the reason why Wilson and others became critical of the American system had to do fundamentally with its inefficiency, its seeming ineffectiveness. It was too slow. It was too hard to get things done. And they could see it that way because, I think, they underestimated the challenge of disunity, the challenge that the system is actually meant to resolve. If your goal is to avert disunity and social breakdown, then you don't just empower narrow majorities to do whatever they want until their mandate ends, which is what parliamentary systems do. You win a bare majority, and you have all the power until you lose your majority. The American system has never worked that way. When you win an election, you don't win all the power. You win a seat at the table. And what happens at the table is negotiation, ongoing negotiation. Even if you win an election, you show up in Washington, and you're surrounded by other people who also won an election, who don't agree with you and don't think you should get your way. And every member of Congress in a majority, every president finds themselves at some point saying, didn't we win the election? How are we still doing this? And the American system is there to make sure they have to ask that question. It does slow you down. It does force you to bargain, to grow your majority, to build a broader coalition because it's got to get through the Senate, not just the House. It needs the president's signature. And ultimately, it faces constant challenges. No one gets all the power, even for a short time. The appeal of the parliamentary system is when you win everything. And the assumption behind that, and I think Wilson's assumption explicitly, is that the nation actually is unified, but our system is preventing us from acting in a unified way.
He thought that,
and
yeah.
the president's job is to express the unity of the nation. The assumption of the American system of government is that the Congress's job is to make unity where it doesn't exist yet, rather than the notion that the federal government is here to express the unity that does exist. That's a difference of opinion that runs very deep. It really goes to the core of how you think about the nature of American society. And if you think there is a unity there that just needs to be expressed, you are going to look to the president. That is the one person who gets elected by the entire nation, and that's
like
Wilson's logic.
We've illuminated something here, but which Dana's going to comment on. The organism metaphor is the wrong metaphor. We are not an organism.
Right.
An organism is parts that contribute to a single whole, and there's a reason center that enacts through the will. We are not parts contributing to a single whole. We have our own ends.
Yeah.
And therefore, what we're missing is not a leader, not a president, but rather the ability to come together to do things
To
together
negotiate.
when we disagree. Dana.
Well, and I was going to say the Wilsonian moment, I mean, I think there's a sort of presidential lineage that began with Andrew Jackson claiming this new idea of the mandate, that he stands for all the people, and thus his decisions represent that kind of unity. And you pull that forward into the Fordist moment, I mean, because the other logic that Wilson's operating within is the new paternalism that's growing through this managerial logic that workers can't be trusted, that they need to have all of their work compartmentalized and supervised to produce more efficiency for the company. So there's a kind of growing management logic that is also informing what eventually emerges as the progressive New Deal that is really inimical to the kinds of democratic, to people's sovereignty and to the hard work of people's sovereignty.
Can any of us imagine now a kind of rhetoric for a pluralist people by a president that is not mere partisan war-making, but actually is constructive and fruitful? I think from your perspective, Dana, that somehow facilitates and encourages people to engage in the hard work of politics. What does that rhetoric look like?
The rhetoric probably looks like things that senators and congressmen say when they're running for the office of president, and then stop saying once they become president. I mean, I'm really loving Philip Wallach's new book, Why Congress, which makes a really passionate case for the importance of Congress to people understanding the hard work of compromise and the long road of compromise, that we need to see representatives working out those disagreements. You know, in my book, I talk about constitutional debates over a plural versus a unitary executive. How different it would have been if there had been 3 people in that office having to negotiate amongst themselves how to lead the United States, rather than this unitary ideal, which is very Oedipalizing, right? We just want to be led, we want to be led, we want him to fix everything. So yeah, I don't really look to the president to fix this problem for us. I think what we have to figure out how to do, and I don't feel expert at all in this, I mean, Wallach ends his book with an open letter to Congress, which I don't think is going to do any good. How do we incentivize Congress to go back to the hard work of democratic consociation, disagreement, and compromise?
That's a great question, Alan. Do you have any view of that?
Lawmaking, let's say that.
I mean, Congress has been institutionally depowered. The bureaucracy exists. Is it possible?
Reagan constantly talked about it as legislative imperialism.
And yet these are forces which have been antagonistic for a good long time, even before Wilson. I don't want to blame Wilson too hard. One can find some of this contest emerging even in the Washington administration between Congress and the executive branch. Washington wants to go into the Senate and talk about this treaty. And he comes out of the Senate chamber, having listened to them do nothing but complain, saying, I'm never going back in there again and talking to them like this. He's going to do something very different. He listens to Hamilton rather than to Jefferson about an economic plan. There are movements like this all through American history, back and forth and back and forth. I thought it was very good to cite Jackson this way, because Jackson really does invent this notion of the presidential mandate. Curiously, Madison is at his most eloquent talking about the need to resist faction in what I think is one of the neglected bits of the Federalist. I think it's Federalist number 14, where he talked, and what he's thinking about here is the disunity of the states, but really it applies as much to us today. And he makes this marvelously eloquent appeal. But he says the American people really are one people. And when they come to you talking about how different and how conflicted you are and how you're all supposed to be at loggerheads with each other, he said, do not let that poison enter
Hearken
into
not
your
to the
ears.
voice, yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's a maybe the most eloquent moment in all of the Federalist Papers, coming from a man that we don't often think of as a great rhetorician. So that struggle there, that's been there for a long time. We see it more dramatic because the stage on which we're operating is more dramatic. I think there are moments of back and forth here. On the one hand, take Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Tocqueville hardly talks about institutions of government, per se, on the national level. Hardly talks about the president at all. He's talking about the mores of Americans. He's talking about local associations. I mean, he's talking about how democracy can, at least in the second part of democracy in America, it can head in these negative directions, but he hardly refers to it. And when Lincoln becomes president, he says that the real cause of the Civil War, the real issue of the Civil War, is whether people can govern themselves, whether self-government is possible. Because you have to think, especially in 1861, all around the United States, the context of the Western world was a context of monarchy. In 1776, we do this thing that's called the Declaration of Independence. And then in 1789, the French follow suit, and we think, aha, we're on the upwards road. Oh, yeah, but then we get the Reign of Terror. We get Robespierre. And then we get Napoleon. Then we get 1815. And by the time we moved to 1861, the United States is the only large-scale functioning democracy in the world. And all of the monarchs are busy sitting on their haunches, and they're thrilled to pieces that the Civil War has broken out. Because here's the United States setting this terrible example to their own peoples, obligingly blowing its brains out in a civil war. I mean, Bismarck said to Thiers in 1871, I used to be a liberal Republican when I was young, but I realized that the only way you can bring a people to greatness is by the monarchy. And Bismarck was really speaking for a broad spectrum of opinion. The crowned heads of Europe were just thrilled at the prospect. Napoleon III wanted a French empire in the New World and thought he was going to get it. You had the King of Belgium, Leopold I, saying the South is going to bring back the aristocratic monarchical principle in the New World. And Lincoln is saying, what's really at stake here? Are we going to demonstrate that democracy really is a farce? That people cannot take charge of their own affairs? That's what the real issue is. That's what he says in 1861. He says it again in 1863 at Gettysburg, and he says it right up to the very end.
Some of these doubts about democracy are what is animating presidents like Wilson who see fascism, National Socialism, and other unified states on the rise, and we wonder whether a democracy can resist them.
Lincoln's argument is, why can we not trust the wisdom of the people? And that is what the Civil War is here to prove, that the people are capable not only of establishing a government, that was the first challenge, he said, not only of protecting it from outside aggression, that was the second challenge, but of protecting it, and this is the third challenge, from internal dissolution. And for Lincoln, what he wants to prove is that a democracy is not a suicide pact.
Yeah, right.
It is not going to self-destruct over dissension and division. Now the question then becomes, if the people themselves are not going to be the cause of difficulty, then where does difficulty come? Does it come from a lack of confidence in the people themselves? And I'm afraid that that may be the real root of things.
Let me see where I think we've ended then.
Yeah.
We'll ask for some audience questions in a second, but I want to ask Yuval a last question. Let me see where I think we landed the plane, and if you think that's, if I'm characterizing it correctly, fine. If you don't, then you can refine this. But it seems to me that we're in agreement that we expect too much of the president today to do the hard work of politics for us, and that this is enervating. It's not just that the president can't do it. It weakens us year by year by year by year. We're in democratic atrophy.
It infantilizes. That's, I like your term that way. It
I thought it was
infantilizes.
a very
yeah.
strong word.
And I do think that it
Let me
keeps
say
us...
one more thing, Yuval, and
Yeah,
then
please.
because there are two sides. And then I think we don't expect enough from our presidents of a certain kind of rhetoric we're actually struggling to imagine. But it's a kind of rhetoric that wouldn't be salvific, as if the president is a kind of a savior figure.
It would
but
be
in
about
some way
co-production.
encourages us to acknowledge the messiness and to take the power that the Constitution gives us and exercise it,
Yes.
even though it's really, it's like being in a sausage factory.
I think another way to put that is that it would be rhetoric that is shaped somehow by the constitutional shape of the office. Presidential rhetoric now has too little to do with the nature of the presidency in our system. And it's very much related to the weakening of Congress. I will say, on that point very quickly, one thing I've learned in the past 15 years since I was a congressional staffer is that, so when I went to graduate school, learning about American government, I was taught to think of it in kind of thermostatic terms. When the president is strong, Congress is weak. When the president is weak, Congress is strong. I think we have learned that it is possible for them both to be weak at the same time, and that Congress's strength is not a function of the president one way or another. It has to be a function of will among the people and will among the members of the institution. I think, for example, that the last two presidents we've had, Biden and Trump, have been the two weakest presidents of my lifetime. It's very hard for me to even say what President Biden wants to do. What are his priorities personally? I have no idea. He's not a very strong president. But Congress has not stepped into the breach at all, and did not last time, when they had a president who I think would have signed anything that passed Congress. Nothing passed Congress, and nothing really does now either. And so the sense that we have the power to govern ourselves through a legislative body is not how Americans tend to think about our government. And I think that is a failure of self-understanding that a Republican people cannot sustain itself through. We have to learn how our system is meant to work if we're going to expect its various officials to do their jobs and demand that they do.
I want to thank our panelists, and I wonder if the conversation has sparked any interest out there, and if you have questions you'd like to put to our panelists. And there are students with mics, so let's just get you a mic.
I think all of you have made really good points about the problem we have. I think Professor Gelzo hit the mark with there's just this, there's this unwillingness to take responsibility of each of the branches. I agree with Professor Nelson. I didn't think, having been through the Vanderbilt English department 40 years ago, I'd be hearing a Vanderbilt English professor talking about this subject, but I shouldn't be surprised. Professor Levin made some really good points, and I have to ask you in all honesty, in general, I don't want you to answer it right now, but if the people on congressional staffs today are part of our ruling class, no wonder our ruling class is utterly pathetic, because I've never seen a dumber bunch in my life than the senior staffers now, and they just are horrible, and there's a handful of staffers who are super sharp, who are dominating the rest of them, and it's sad, but it's also a bit comical.
Question mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll stand up for them, by the way. I don't really agree with that. At the very least, I think they're about as smart as ever, and I do mean that as a compliment.
They're not as informed, though. They're not. They didn't get the graduate training you did, and I mentored, just as an example, Professor Nelson, I mentored some Vanderbilt pre-law students a dozen years ago. They're very bright, They're very, very polite, but they just don't have the knowledge base.
Let me ask the panelists to comment, if they wish to, on the speaker's point. If not, we will take another question.
I will just say, I think that the problem has to do with public expectations of our system more than with the intelligence of the people involved. People in Congress are smart, ambitious people. A lot of people on the staffs of congressional offices are very smart, ambitious people. They're doing what they're incentivized to do by our system and our political culture, and those incentives are crazy.
I want to say just a couple things too. I think within the last 20, 30 years has emerged a philosophy of governing that we could encapsulate in Sunstein's concept of nudging, which is that people are stupid. Tom Frank, what's the matter with Kansas? They don't know their own interest, and that the job of the political class is to know for them and to help them be okay with that. And that is the opposite of democracy. That is the paternalism that took root in the Fordist moment. It is enormously condescending, and it is stupid. Because ordinary people, I mean, I really believe we have the right to self-determination. And ordinary people are often very decent at self-determination when they're given the opportunity. But when they're sneered at and treated as too stupid, that becomes a problem. I think it is a problem. The other part of the problem is the way presidentialism has drafted the nationalization of our political system. People are putting all of their energy into one office at the center of the nation and not paying attention to all of the local political opportunities. And there's incredible opportunity for education, involvement, all of that stuff that we're neglecting and that we need to put more energy of our own back into.
Other questions? Make sure there's a question mark and a real one at the end of it, and I'll take you right here. Yes, sir. I'll work my way this way. I saw all your hands. How come you guys don't have any questions? Okay, we'll get there.
Hi. I was wondering if you could comment on the increasing role of the United States on the global stage and how that's affected the role of the presidency in the last 50 to 70 years, really since World War II, maybe.
Thank you.
So, I mean, look, I think the centrality of the president in foreign affairs has always been central to the president's power. And as that has grown, that power has certainly grown. I think there's a way in which the character of the presidential office is directed above all to action in the present tense, right? Congress frames laws for the future. The courts review actions that happened in the past. The president lives in the present and responds on behalf of the country to exigencies in the world. And so the more central our country is in the world, the more that our reaction matters, the more central the president is. There's no way around that. I think that surely has to do with the growth of presidentialism, which I agree has come to overtake our thinking about politics. That demands greater assertiveness from the other branches, and of course that doesn't always happen.
Can I take your question, please? Yes. Yes, you, and get a mic. Oh, perfect. We need a mic in the front row.
I can yell, it's okay.
Even for the recording, I think it would be good. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Hi, I'm one of the Baylor and Washington students who's here for this cohort, so just wanted to say thank you to everybody for that. And then I had a question specifically for you, Professor Galzo, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name.
I have trouble with it myself.
And this is free for anybody to comment on, but I know that you're the one who brought it up. I recently took a presidential history class where we kind of talked a little bit about Lincoln, FDR, and Wilson specifically, and I thought the comparison was really interesting, especially when you said that the Civil War and following it didn't become really regulatory. And do you think that that was necessarily because Lincoln didn't live to see the Reconstruction era? Do you think it may have gone different? Because I know there are a lot of critics out there of Lincoln exercising what is probably like some of the more harsh and robust presidential powers. Not that I'm like taking any side on that, but I would just love to hear your take on that and wonder
Thank
if it did any different, or if it
Well,
would be any differently.
This is bordering on a what-if question. So, and what-if questions are always dicey.
Sorry.
The Civil War was an unprecedented event, politically speaking. And Lincoln does a number of things that were unprecedented. We often think about executive unilateralism as a modern, as a recent phenomenon. And yet the truth is, when Lincoln is dealing with the outbreak of the Civil War, the firing on Fort Sumter specifically, Lincoln moves at once to do a number of things. He calls out the army, he calls out the volunteers, calls up the militia, he appropriates money for their support, he declares a blockade of the Confederate coast. These are all extraordinary actions, and he does it without Congress. Congress is not in session when any of this has happened, and he doesn't call them into session until July 4th, 1861. Now, people have sometimes said, well, that's because this is the first example of executive unilateralism. He really liked it that way. He wanted a period of time where he could operate on his own. Actually, it's a little bit more practical than that, because a number of the congressional districts and a number of states had not yet elected their members of Congress. They were then on a very staggered system of elections. So he didn't have a Congress he could call together until July 4th, 1861. But even so, when he does bring them together, he submits his actions to them and at least gets a post hoc approval. Sometimes it's a slightly grudging one when he suspends the writ of habeas corpus. He wants Congress to approve that. And they hem and haw for almost 2 years. And when they finally, in the closing days of the 37th Congress, pass a habeas corpus act, it's not the one he wants. So there is a tension right there, and we're not talking about anything that happened in the past 10, 20 years either. We're talking about going back to the situation of Lincoln. And yet, at the same time, Lincoln is also heading towards a point when the war is over for things to end and to resort to some kind of quote-unquote normal. Would Reconstruction have challenged that for him? We do not know. Now, one can take some, I think, idea of direction from Ulysses Grant's presidency. And I have argued in a number of places for recovering the importance of Ulysses Grant as a president. And Grant does take some dramatic action as president, for which he receives next to nothing in the way of credit, I'm sorry to say. Is it the kind of action that takes us beyond the bounds of the 19th century presidency into some 20th century example? No, not really. Now, he does suspend the writ of habeas corpus, but he suspends it basically in one place, which is South Carolina. He does take a number of actions to encourage the Reconstruction regimes in the South, but at the end of the day, he is really going to step back and let them make their own decisions. In some cases, let them fall flat on their faces if that's what's necessary. Part of that is because he doesn't have Congress with him the whole time. We go through a recession in 1873. That has a negative impact on the elections in 1874. The Congress that gets elected in 1874 returns a Democratic majority to the House of Representatives. After that point, there's not going to be any funding for Reconstruction initiatives, whether Ulysses Grant wants them or not. So there you see operating a dynamic well in advance of some of these more recent examples we have talked about. There is, in other words, a certain tension which is built into this relationship between the people and their government, between the branches and each other. That tension has been there for a very long time. The question is whether current circumstances have aggravated it to a point that it is no longer possible to talk about the kind of democracy, the kind of republic that the founders wanted to talk about. That, I think, is the long historical view.
Great to have a historian with us, isn't it? His answer was no. But he's got all the depth. I want to take a question.
I do footnotes.
Right back here.
I love
Right here. Yep, you. Yes. I'm not wearing my glasses if I know you, and I'm not calling you by your name. It might be Paul.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. Professor Nelson, I had a question for you specifically. I like that you mentioned social media and the way that it incentivizes anger in order to really get attention. And in this first past the post system, what can be done to incentivize unity? What can be done to incentivize people to come together rather than really just going after this anger and trying to divide our nation?
Well, get off social media, which hates your soul. That's Jaron Lanier, I'm quoting. I think we really have not yet fully paid attention to the degree that the algorithms that drive all media now are jerking us around emotionally and making our disunity feel fatal. Because ideally in democracy, we don't have unity, we have functional disunity. In other words, we agree to keep disagreeing together. We agree to keep making compromises that will sometimes cost us personally. We keep doing it together, knowing that we are never going to be fully unified, because that is the best way we know how to make a political and social world together. And it is. It's, you know, and there are all kinds of jokes about democracy. I like Win Caitlin's line, it's the art of saying nice snake while you look for a big stick. Democracy is not fun to do. It's just not. It's not supposed to be. So the ideal of unity kind of dresses it up and makes us susceptible to presidents who promise they're going to unify us. I don't think we want to live in a unified world. Worlds that are unified tend to be totalitarian. They are not pleasant worlds to live in. They cause us to have to shave off 3/4 of our public selves and keep them private. We don't want that.
Such an important point. Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, that was a good question. I was going to ask something similar, but I also wanted to know what sort of systemic changes we could make to our, right now, given what we've inherited, to promote more unity, if not among the people, among our politicians. I think a particularly trendy idea right now is ranked choice voting and things like that, these alternative structures of institutions that can encourage that sort of more high-minded unity. So I'm curious what you think some of these systemic changes might be that are effective and have been proven to be effective elsewhere.
Do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. I think that thinking about structural change is the right way to think about a problem like that, because the underlying fact of our differences is a fact, and I very much agree that it is a welcome fact. We are a free society and therefore a diverse society, and so the only way to stop being diverse is to stop being free, and we don't want to do that. Therefore, we should think about institutions that enable us to act together even when we don't think alike. I think we have such institutions. Our constitutional system is built for that, but we've built on top of it a set of institutions that create incentives that work in a different direction. The primary system is a great example. That's not in the Constitution. It's a fairly modern innovation. I mean, we've been using it in Congress for 100 years or so, but in presidential races for about half that time. The primary system encourages divisiveness and not unity, because its purpose is not to drive us to build broad coalitions, but to intensify our base of support. It's not crazy, but it's not a good solution to the problem that we have. And so I do think it makes sense, for example, to experiment with ranked choice voting in primaries, in party primaries. I wouldn't do it in general elections, because I think our two-party system actually is a way to build coalitions, to encourage us to build coalitions. Each party needs to be as broad as possible, and that creates incentives for it to speak to as broad a slice of the country as possible. The primaries create incentives to push in the opposite direction, and I think those have to be rethought. We have to be willing to change rules when they're bad for us, and we do confront some rules and systems that in this moment just clearly are bad for us.
Can I add one thing to that? Because I think there's a tension here. We don't want to see a uniformity of poured concrete. But I think we do want to see a unity that emerges out of a set of perceived and embraced principles.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And those are the principles that I think that are embodied in the Declaration, that are captured in the Constitution. And I think it's important for Americans as a whole to look back to the Declaration and to see that what was captured in those words was as close as one can get in politics to a kind of holy writ. That this really does describe the way human beings are in political life. And Lincoln himself said that he'd never had a thought politically that didn't spring from the Declaration of Independence. And I would like to see that as a conviction, that Americans constantly bring themselves back to the test of the Declaration, that Americans bring themselves back to the definitions of democracy that were important for people like Lincoln, about the importance of elections, because elections are about accountability. I mean, sometimes we think elections are about when I get my way, when we get power. No, fundamentally, elections are about accountability. That people who are in positions of responsibility and power know that a day is coming, and coming soon, when they will have to face the voters. The consent of the governed. Lincoln said that the consent of the governed was the sheet anchor of American republicanism. Constantly to remind presidents, congresses, bureaucracies, that fundamentally what this is about, this whole American experiment, is about the consent of the governed. I think those are principles upon which a healthy, not a concrete, a healthy unity from that it can spring.
Can I say a word to that? I think there's a I very much agree with that, and I think that it pushes us to think about our country and its challenges as belonging to us all together. I'll tell you a very quick story. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Israel. I came here as a child. I was 8 years old. I became an American citizen when I was 19. And when I took the oath, this ancient federal judge at the federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey, got up to give a speech. And I thought he would talk about, by then I was already a history buff and a patriot, and I thought he was going to talk about Lincoln and he was going to talk about Madison. He didn't say any of that. He gave a really short speech, and he said, from now on, you have to talk about America in the first person plural. And I wrote this down because I couldn't quite piece together what he meant. And what it means to talk in the first person plural is to say we and us, and not them and they when we talk about the United States. We is a really important word. It's the first word of the Constitution. It's the first word of that glorious second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It's what you say when you mean to talk about your country in the first person plural, and to think of it as being your responsibility and being your inheritance. It's ours. It's
Yes.
us. It's
Yes.
we. That kind of unity absolutely is available to us as Americans.
On the 10th of July, 1858, Lincoln gave a speech in Chicago. And he said one of the things that I think is one of his greatest utterances. He said, the generation that knew the revolution is passing away. We now have people who have no living memory of the revolution. What's more, he said fully half of the people living in the United States now came from someplace else. They came from Scandinavia, Germany, France, or also the offspring of those who did. They don't have, they're not connected. They don't have relatives that fought in the revolution. And yet he said when they read in that old declaration that all men are created equal, then they feel that they are flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of those men that wrote the Declaration, and so they are, because those words, he said, are the electric cord that runs through and unites all lovers of liberty. That's we.
Yep.
That is us. And I think that is a sublime statement of genuine unity in the American experiment.
We lovers of liberty. It's beautiful.
I'm going to take one more question, but I would like to ask that I know the panelists personally. They're gracious, and they're going to stick around. And if you have questions you didn't get to ask, I hope you would run up and ask a panelist. I'm going to take this question that I promised right here. Yes, sir, you with the hand up. Yes, with the glasses. Sometimes I point to somebody, and the person behind them grabs the mic. Okay.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank the Ford Foundation and Baylor University for setting up a forum for so many young college students and graduate students who are considering and pursuing a career in public service to learn and to listen. And so thank you for coming to this, and thank you for your commitment to learning. I, for one, just want to say I think you're all very bright. So thank you for coming. So here's my question, and I'm going to try to make it as concise as possible, but it needs to be in 3 parts. First of all, and I mean I'm going to be very concise. First of all, what, if any, credence do you give to the growing notion in some spheres that the Overton window has split? And if so, How does that influence or complicate presidential rhetoric if there's two windows? And then third, and most importantly for me as ordained clergy, it seems to me that the church used to function in a way of at least somehow anchoring that window and keeping it from just free flowing. And now it seems as though, at least on one side of that Orthodox Christian equation, the church seems to be complicit in the movement of that window in a particular direction. If so, is that correct? And what do you think about that?
For students who don't know or for anyone who doesn't know what the Overton window is, it's the range of legitimate views, which you can push by doing radical things or super conservative things. So it's actually movable. And so the question is, has it split into two? Which I think the answer is obviously yes, if you follow Pew. If you follow the Pew statistics on the two nodal points, the red and the blue. But the question about the church, and I would like to expand the question to the role of religion in the United States, not just any particular church.
I mean, look, I think in general, the power of mainstream culture is not what it was. There is not a single mainstream in the way in which we had in say, the second half of the 20th century, which we take to be a norm in these conversations. I would argue it was not a norm. The second half of the 20th century was very, very odd. The 1950s and 60s in particular, which all of the 80-year-olds who run everything in our politics think is normal, were not normal. America is actually accustomed to division. And we do have ways of living with division. We are far more divided than we were in the immediate wake of World War II. But are we far more divided than we were in the second half of the 19th century? I think in some ways yes, in some ways no. These are kinds of problems we've dealt with before. So my way of thinking about the Overton window question is, let's find out. I think it is possible to build a broad coalition, for example, and win 60% of the vote in an election in America. But the only way to know is to try. And neither of our parties has been willing to try for 30 years.
Can I just jump in and say, I think the Overton window is split on Twitter. Social media, but so few people in our country are active participants in that venue, in that forum. There's a new Rasmussen poll out on the elites. I can't remember the name of the center that produced it. But the elite class has a radically different understanding of how our country should prioritize its business than ordinary Americans, which constitute the vast majority of us. And to the extent that our political, corporate, military elite are disconnected from the majority of our people, that's a split I would much rather talk about than what's going on in the Twitter universe that the people I know and work with live in. It's possible not to live in that world and to be very informed. I just would like to say.
I think your religion question might be too hard to take up in the brief amount of time that we have. I respect the question. We can talk about it afterwards. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you.